also an executive member of the Palestine Forum. We're a newly formed student club at the University of Toronto dedicated to promoting, curating, and supporting student work on Palestine. We host events in collaboration with other student groups focusing on a diverse number of themes, including arts, diaspora studies, history, music, film, debate, law, amongst others. It's important to remember how space design and cartography are all tools that can very well be exploited to suppress and oppress marginalized communities and people. This lecture will serve as a very important reminder of the discipline's role in this exploitation. So I'm happy to pass the mic over to Professor Jens Hansen, who will go over to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yasmin. So, dear friends of Free Palestine, welcome to our 5th event. My name is Jens Hansen, and I've taught topics such as Arab intellectuals, Palestinian history, and other subjects at UofT since 2002. It's a distinct pleasure for me personally, and for all of us at Hearing Palestine, to welcome back Nadi Abusaada. I say welcome back, for 2 reasons. First, Nadi was supposed to give his talk, as Alejandro mentioned earlier, on April 29th, just a couple of days after COUT censured UofT for allowing anti-Palestinian donor interests to interfere in an academic hiring process. Nadi was one of the first to decline the invitation to honor the national censure. And in spite of his junior and vulnerable status as a PhD candidate, he sent a gracious public note explaining his decision. And I quote in part, and you can see it on the slide. Dear colleagues, in light of the recent censure issued by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, I will not be giving this lecture planned for the 29th of April. I write this with the hope that the university meets the demands of COUT and fulfills its duty to protect academic freedom. In solidarity, Nadi Abusaada. We are relieved, Nadi, that you've accepted our re-invitation today. The censure has been lifted, but the issues that led to it have still not all been resolved. For a detailed discussion, please join our colleagues at Censure UofT after this talk. And I think Dana might just be putting up the link for your registration. Now, the second reason why I'm so pleased to welcome back Nadi Abusaada is because he is the 4th alumni we are hosting at Hearing Palestine. After Diana Butu, Dr. Razak Tekriti, and Ardi Imseis. Nadi was a double major undergraduate in architecture and urban studies with a minor in geographical information systems here at UofT from 2012 to 2016. He joined my Arab intellectuals class in his final year and wrote a superb research paper on Hassan Kanafani as an accomplished Palestinian writer and committed literary critic in existentialist conversation with Jean-Paul Sartre and Sadiq al-Azm and others before and after the Egyptian and Syrian defeats of 1967. Rereading his paper now, it is uncanny how Kanafani and Nadi in this paper have scripted Hearing Palestine's vision. For we are building Palestine studies at UofT based on 3 research propositions that already appear in Nadi's Kanafani paper from 2016. For us, Palestine is a country. Palestine is also a metaphor with Mahmoud Darwish. And Palestine is a method to understand the human condition. Nadi could have easily published this undergraduate paper. It was very special. Instead, he committed himself to study the urban history of Palestine, and with huge impact. He has already published his research in prestigious journals, like the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. He has held major doctoral research fellowships during his time at Cambridge University, UK, and he is co-founder of Arab Urbanism magazine, as well as a regular contributor to IPS's Palestine Square. Currently, Nadi is our Han fellow, postdoctoral fellow in Islamic architecture and urbanism at MIT. And he speaks to us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nadi will present his groundbreaking postdoctoral research project, Spatial Encounters, Aerial Imagery, Mapping in Palestine's Colonial Landscape. And it seems to mark a new departure from his dissertation. His dissertation is on the transition of Jaffa and Nablus from late Ottoman times to the British Mandate. I look forward to your defense next month, Nadi. Now, the Zoom room is yours. Welcome back, Nadi. Solidarity with Desmond Cole.
Just trying to. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me today. And thank you, Jens, for the very generous introduction. It is a great honor to be back at UofT with all of you, and I hope I can visit you all soon in person. It's also wonderful to see that Palestine studies is being foregrounded and given the space it deserves. So thank you for making this happen, despite the many challenges that you've been going through at UofT the past year or so. My talk today will be based on some of the research I've been doing over the past few years on the history of aerial photography and its development in Palestine between the two world wars, sort of parallel to my dissertation work. And this research is a part of a broader international project to think about the histories of Palestine from above. And the materials I'll be presenting have been published in an exhibition book for an exhibition on the history and present of aerial photography that opened its doors just last month in Ramallah at the Qattan Foundation. And these are just photos from that exhibition. As has been said already, I come from an architectural background, so my interests in the modern history of Palestine are mainly focused on the physical landscape and the changes it underwent in the last century of imperial and colonial rule. So my approach to aerial photography and cartography in today's presentation will be mainly centered around their relationship to the physical landscape. So the two main questions I am asking are, first, what does the history of aerial photography add to our understanding of the history of modern Palestine and the shifting colonial visions of its urban landscape in the interwar period? And second, what does Palestine add to our understanding of the global history of aerial photography and its relationship to urban environments and landscapes, particularly in the colonized world? And my presentation today will be divided into three main parts: the desert, the hills, and the city. Of course, these divisions are not to be taken very rigidly. And as we will see, each of them sort of contains elements of the other two. But they are useful in that they begin to point at how aerial power and imagery was differently tied into the different topographies of Palestine and the Middle East region. So there's also a chronological order to my presentation that I would like to highlight. In the first part, I start with World War I and the different experimentations in the aerial photography and cartography experimentations by the two sides of the war on the Palestine front. So we have the Germans and the Ottomans on one side, and the Australians and the British on the other. In the second, we move to the 1930s and specifically to the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine and the British use of air power in their counter-insurgency in the hills. And in the third, we shift to the coast, specifically to the city of Jaffa, to examine how the view from above intertwined with colonial visions of Palestinian urban space. But before we start with the First World War, let us go a little bit back in time for some context. What is important to remember here is that before the war starts, Palestine had been under Ottoman rule for around 4 centuries. But it's really around the late 19th century that the significance of its strategic and military position for the Ottoman Empire really heightens. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire in 1883, and this is Palestine. And Palestine at this point is divided into a series of administrative units that are part of the provinces of Beirut and Jerusalem and is bordering Egypt to the west. Now, a lot is happening in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire is facing both external and internal challenges. Externally, it's facing fierce competition and pressure from European empires. And internally, it's undergoing a major administrative restructuring and reformation. It's also facing a lot of financial difficulties and growing desires for independence in some of its provincial territories. So in the midst of all of this, in 1882, the British occupy Egypt, and that's mainly to solidify their control of the Suez Canal, among many other things. So Palestine, and specifically southern Palestine, or the Naqab Desert, turns into an international border between the Ottoman and British empires. And one of the main questions that emerges in this period, and this is a question that has been quite overlooked in academic scholarship, is where to set the boundaries between Ottoman Palestine and the British-controlled Sinai. So from the 1880s onwards, there begins a series of negotiations between the Ottomans and the British regarding this question. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because cartography here becomes a key instrument for marking territory and setting imperial boundaries for both the Ottomans and for the British. And Palestine becomes a main site where these cartographic practices start to hold a lot of political weight. So both the British and the Ottomans start to hire cartographers to make maps of their proposed borders. This is an Ottoman map where we can see the boundaries of southern Palestine extending into the Sinai before the two parties agreed on the 1906 iteration, which is actually still the border today. Now, although the question of the boundaries sorts of becomes settled by 1906, this settlement never really stopped the Ottomans from being fearful of the idea that the British could one day extend their foot into Palestine. So it's in this context that the Ottomans decide to build a new city in southern Palestine, which is the town of Bir Saba, or Beersheba, which we can see here is located quite close to the border. Now, Beersheba is quite interesting because it's one of the few examples in modern Ottoman history where a city was planned from scratch rather than as an extension of an existing urban center. And we can see this from an aerial photograph, which was taken during the war, that the city's planning follows a grid scheme with a very rational and ordered layout. It's a kind of city that is created to be viewed from above and not only from ground level. Now, of course, it's important here to note that the Naqab Desert is mainly inhabited by a Bedouin population, and the plan to build a new city was also linked to a certain Ottoman civilizational attitude towards nomadic population throughout the empire in this period, and also their attempts to urbanize them. And we can talk more about this if there's interest. So the town is really playing this dual role. One is internal and one is external. On the one hand, it's trying to get the Bedouin tribes on the side of the Ottomans. And on the other, it's trying to solidify Ottoman presence in southern Palestine to protect it from the British. Now, what happens is that within a few years of building the city, World War I starts. And the Ottomans enter the war on the side of the Germans and against the Allies. So the fears that had been simmering for a few decades regarding losing southern Palestine turn into an actual concern. Now, what's important for us here is that unlike previous wars which were mainly fought on the ground and with troops facing each other, World War I aerial power comes into play, and ruling airspace and the ability to capture landscapes and terrain from above becomes intricately tied to the idea of winning in ground battles. As we see this photograph, as soon as the Ottomans joined the war, they set up an aerodrome with the Germans in Beersheba. They also extend the Hijaz railway line to the city to aid the movement of military troops from Syria to the Naqab. Now, of course, in Egypt too, the British were setting up their own air forces, and those were mostly of Australian pilots. Now, in her memoirs, the Turkish novelist Khalid Edib writes about visiting Beersheba with Ottoman military commander Jamal Pasha during the war. Of course, Jamal Pasha was quite a genocidal figure during World War I, and she had helped him set up an orphanage in Lebanon where they were Turkifying Armenian kids. So there's a quite dark legacy there. But anyway, during her visit, she manages to convince one of the German pilots to take her on a ride of one of the airplanes. And as she was flying, the main thing she was astonished by, and I quote, was the yellow vastness of the desert and its wonderfully smooth mountains, flying at a terrible pace under us in oblique vision, end quote. She also writes of how the machines were so unfamiliar to the desert, which is usually depicted as an untamed and undiscovered terrain. Now, around the same time, there was an Ottoman propaganda publication coming out of Beersheba during the war, which was titled The Desert Illustrated. And it included several of the German aerial photographs of the Naqab to contrast between the Ottoman modernization in Beersheba and the desert landscape. This was its cover, and we can see an illustration on the right from a bird's eye view of the Hijaz Railway cutting through the desert and extending all the way from Palestine to Egypt. We can even see the pyramids on the top right. But for now, of course, as we'll see later, the British also had a cultural association of aerial photography with the desert. But for now, let's go back to what was happening during the war. So the British enter Palestine from the south through Gaza and Beersheba and sort of start making their way up north into central Palestine. Now, as they go further north, the role of aerial power becomes more pressing for both the British and the Ottoman German forces. So both sides begin to send airplanes to capture aerial images of enemy military bases to try and help estimate their sizes and predict their movements. Now, this is a map I created by geolocating the data from the Bavarian State Archives. So every square on the map corresponds with an aerial photograph taken by the German pilots during the war. This is just a more zoomed in version of the map to give you a sense of the density of these photographs and their overlapping nature. But let's go back to this larger map. We can see that the photographs were mainly concentrated along Palestine's coastal and central regions and the territories surrounding the Jaffa-Jerusalem railway line, which is really the horizontal strip that we see. And this was because this was one of the most strategic connections and sites of battle during the war. So really, we can almost trace the theater of war through these photographs. And these are just some of examples of the aerial photographs taken by the Germans and the Australians of their own airport facilities. And you know, the thing with capturing a photograph like this is that you can analyze it and then begin to infer really important information about your enemy. So for instance, the size of their encampments, their numbers, their facilities, their movement, and things like that. And then this information would be translated onto maps that further allowed military operations and strategic planning, like this Ottoman map of British troops in Gaza and Beersheba, just as an example. Now, as the British armies were advancing more north, they began to realize the very different nature of the battlefield in central Palestine. Images of the desert begin to fade, and a new topography begins to unfold in their horizons. Unlike the Sinai and the Naqab, where they were faced with an open terrain and a sparsely inhabited landscape, in central Palestine, they were facing defense lines in urban settings and had to adjust to dealing with trench-based warfare and very dense areas. Now, the problem was that the maps of Palestine that the British were using at the time were older maps from the 1880s produced by the British-run Palestine Exploration Fund. And these maps were not detailed enough and not really suitable for military operations. They were mostly intended for archaeological purposes. So there was this need for new maps, but of course, the places the British wanted to map out were still controlled by the Ottomans. So you can't simply send surveyors to go and draw them on the ground as you usually would. So they had to somehow figure out a way of utilizing aerial photography for making maps. And this is the main protagonist behind this innovation. His name is Captain Hamshall Thomas. And he was a botanist who taught at Cambridge University, both before and after the war. And what he did is basically, he sent a number of airplanes with highly skilled pilots who took the risk of flying at low altitudes to take aerial photographs with a closer view of the landscape. And then he devised a new cartographic method that used these overlapping photographs and corrected their distortions to produce reliable maps of central Palestine. Now, this is quite a significant moment for the history of map making globally. This was the first time that something like this was ever done, and it took place on the Palestine front. Now, by the end of the war, more than 3,000 square kilometers of the country were mapped using this new technique of map production. This is just some data from the Australian archives showing the areas covered by these maps. And this is an example of one of these maps, and we can see the high level of detailing in them, of the topography especially. Now, what's interesting is that although the war ends, these wartime aerial photographs of Palestine begin to have lives of their own. Immediately when he returns to Cambridge, Thomas begins publishing papers on the valuable lessons in aerial photography and mapping on the Palestine front. He explains that the mapping techniques developed during the war possessed great potentialities as instruments of scientific research and were potentially useful for fields of geology, botany, meteorology, and archaeology. But it's not only the British aerial photographs of Palestine that had afterlives. The German ones did too. Around the same time Thomas was publishing his papers in England, in Germany, an Orientalist named Gustav Dahlmann was preparing a book called 100 Aerial Photographs of Palestine, based on the German aerial photographs taken during the war. So similar to Thomas, Dahlmann was also interested in the potentials of aerial photography beyond warfare and militaristic operations. But unlike Thomas, whose encounter with Palestine was very brief, Dahlmann had actually worked in Palestine for years before the war as an archaeologist and as a botanist. And we can see this from his portrait of him, which depicts both elements quite well. So Dahlmann was really invested in how wartime aerial photographs could be used to interpret the landscape of Palestine specifically. Now, it's important to note here that already during the war, the Ottomans and the Germans were already quite active in using aerial photography in archaeological work. These are some examples of some of the books of archaeology of the Naqab and the Sinai deserts based on aerial photographs, and one of them even has a preface written by Jamal Pasha. But what's interesting in Dahlmann's book is that he's interested not only in archaeology, but in the landscape's features in the present. Interestingly, he makes two comments that are worth noting. First of all, he dismisses the pre-photographic representations of Palestine's landscape as overtly romanticized, biblified, and based on ideological distortions than historical and geographical study. Second, while he celebrates the work of early professional photographers in the region, like the Bonfield studio in Beirut, he is critical of their tendency to cater their photography to market demand by focusing on monumental sites instead of taking photographs that are useful for the geographical and historical study of the landscape. So when he was looking at the archive of German aerial photographs during the war, Dahlmann saw an opportunity to move beyond these trends. And he writes, and I quote, "Only aerial photographs could replace the artificial image of the landscape with reality seen from above, namely the place with its surroundings, the external conditions of its existence, and its present and potential lines of communication." As we can see here, for each aerial photograph he included in his book, he added a written description of their visible topographical and geographical features, and details like names of neighborhoods, infrastructures, and important buildings and sites. So unlike the biblical accounts of Palestine's physical landscape that were common by his contemporary Orientalists and biblical scholars, or photographic albums of the Holy Land sold to tourists, Dahlmann's book acknowledged the features of urban transformation that Palestine's landscape had been witnessing since the 19th century. Now, what's important about publications like these is that they show us that the role of aerial photography, both during and in the years immediately following the war, had far exceeded its uses for military operations. Instead, we see that one of the main effects of the advent of aerial photography was a shift in the way that the physical landscapes were interpreted, especially through new scientific methods and instruments. We also see that the Palestine front was a primary site where some of these developments first emerged. Now, of course, despite claims of their objectivity, aerial photographs from this point onwards became key instruments for the objectification of the landscape below and its abstraction into a series of recognizable features that allowed not only for its study, but also its conquest. And while very significant during World War I and its immediate aftermaths, as we will see, these aerial objectifications and abstractions proved to have much more radical usages during the Mandate period. And this is especially as the British colonial administration tried to tame the multiple anti-colonial revolts taking place both in Palestine, but also elsewhere in the region. This moves us to the second part of this talk, where we'll talk or examine some of the usages of aerial power by the British, specifically in their counterinsurgency activity in the colonies, but also specifically in the Palestinian hills in Palestine, in the Palestinian hills during the 36 anti-colonial revolt. Now, of course, as most of you will know, the British occupied Palestine in 1917, and the military occupation lasted a few years until they established so-called civil colonial administration in 1920. And what's of concern to us here is that whereas for the Germans, the end of the war was the end of their aerial influence in the Middle East, for the British, it was only the start of aerial experimentation. And one of the earliest, and actually one of the most radical air operations carried by the British immediately after the war was in Iraq, and it was to suppress the Iraqi revolt of 1920. Here I draw on the work of historian Priya Satya, who explains that the British saw aerial strategies as particularly suitable for Mesopotamia, not only due to financial reasons, as it is often claimed. Instead, she shows that cultural motivations were an equally significant part of their choice, and that they were quite convinced that, and I quote, aircraft could rule the desert. So this is similar to the idea I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the Ottoman cultural attitude towards the Naqab, but this is of course taking that idea to a whole new level. And this is a quite helpful quote from Satya's book, where she talks about how British experts saw Mesopotamia as, and I quote, more suitable for air operations than Europe for aesthetic as much as topographical reasons. Now, what's important for us is that the British also thought that these strategies, which were known as air control, were only suitable in Iraq and not in other contexts where counter-revolutionary activity had to be conducted in more densely populated urban environments. And Palestine was included in that category. And this is quite explicit. So this is Sir Arthur Harris, who was a main air commander in Iraq and later in Palestine. And he writes, and I quote, "It had never been proposed to exercise the same kind of air control over Palestine as over Iraq." Of course, Harris would later come to fame during World War II, when he was one of the main British air commanders. And he was quite known for his brutality, not only with the German civilians, but also with his own pilots. So he's quite hated in the UK. But anyway, all of this is to say that here we can already see that some of the main figures who lead Britain into victory in World War II had already been serving in the colonies beforehand. And I would even suggest that many of the aerial strategies used against the colonies also proved quite useful during the war. And this is where the Palestine and the Great Revolt comes in. Now, there were two main reasons why the British couldn't rely on Air Force alone in their counterinsurgency in Palestine as they did in Iraq. The first reason was that by the 1930s, the British civil administration in Palestine was well established, and any military action, including Air Force, had to be coordinated with ground police forces. The second reason was the hilly and densely populated nature of Palestine's topography, particularly the central region where the rebellion was concentrated. And this is a British painting from World War I of Wadi al-Far'a in central Palestine, just to give you a sense of the nature of the topography that we're dealing with, but also how the British saw it. Now, it's important to point out here as well that British air activity during the revolt had to be different not only from Iraq, but also from their own aerial efforts in Palestine during World War I, which we discussed earlier. And this is first because, as I was mentioning, most of the revolt activities were concentrated in central Palestine, whereas the most decisive battles during the war were conducted in the southern part of Palestine. But it was also because of the nature of the so-called enemy being confronted. Now, unlike the Ottoman and German troops, Palestinian activity in the hills was mainly led by guerrilla fighters who had no identifiable headquarters or key communication lines that could be targeted. They were always on the move, and their activities depended on maintaining a high level of elusiveness and unpredictability. The reason I mention all of these elements is because it had a direct influence on the nature of counterinsurgency tactics that the British would use during the Great Revolt. We know this from a report the British produced in 1938 on the lessons learned from their counterinsurgency during the revolt. In it, both British policy as a civil administration and the nature of the topography of the hills where the Palestinian guerrilla fighters were located are cited as the main reasons behind the counterinsurgency strategy that they developed. This strategy was called combined action. The idea of combined action was quite simple. It meant carrying out military operations based on the combined effort of ground and air forces. It was mainly a communications strategy that ensured that the surveillance information that the aircrafts were collecting could be immediately sent to the ground troops, which would act quickly. They did this through what we can call an aerial partitioning of Palestine, basically literally dividing the country into 4 aircraft zones, which we can see on the map here. And in each of these zones, there would be an Air Force command that is reachable through wireless communication with military vehicles on the ground, just to ensure air-ground coordination. This is an illustration in the report of how they were able to contain Palestinian guerrillas in the hills, which we see in yellow, and attack them with ground forces based on the information received from aerial forces. Now, the British consider their success in taming the revolt as mainly the result of this strategy. They write, and I quote, "Practically every case of a successful attack on armed rebels resulted from the combined efforts of air and land forces." And they explain that local conditions on the ground and policy made combined action an especially effective weapon in Palestine. What's at stake in all of this is that the success of this strategy in Palestine starts to inform British Royal Air Force activity throughout the empire. We are talking about a time when all of these experimentations were exported and imported between the different colonial territories. So already in 1937, we get an account by a well-known military commander who writes, and I quote, that judging on reports from India, Palestine, and East Africa, I think the Army and the Air Force can congratulate themselves on having reached a very high degree of mutual understanding and confidence, end quote. So this brings us again to the global significance of what's going on in Palestine, which is to say that thinking about the interwar period through counterinsurgency in the colonies is essential for understanding how the British developed their military strategies for World War II. So the colonies were serving as the main testing grounds for many of the strategies that would later prove useful against the Germans. And with the Great Revolt ending in 1939, Palestine was in fact one of the most recent examples that they could refer to. Now, of course, what all of this meant is that colonial territories and their populations had to bear the consequences of British experimentations in counterinsurgency. Now, in Palestine, the material traces that the British left during the revolt still have a lot of influence over the country's physical environment, and particularly its urban landscape. And in a way, we can say that these traces are characterized by a certain duality, which is that of construction and destruction. So on the one hand, the British were building enormous military infrastructures, mainly in the form of concrete fortresses, which are known as Taggart forts. These fortresses were built in all of the main towns, serving as prisons and as military bases for British soldiers. They were named after Charles Taggart, who was brought in from India to Palestine in 1937 to serve as the general inspector on security matters. And you'll remember that we spoke about Palestine's southern border earlier, but this is when the northern border with Lebanon and Syria becomes more of a hard border, and that's mainly Taggart's doing. So we see the Taggart wall here on the left. But to go back to the forts, many of them are still there today, and now they serve both Israel and the Palestinian Authority as military bases or prisons. And this is an example of what they looked like. But besides building these fortresses, the British also relied heavily on destroying buildings as a form of punitive action in the main cities. And of course, this is also a strategy that's heavily implemented today by Israel, and especially in Jerusalem, but its legacies are really rooted in the British period and in the Great Revolt in particular. And one of the most drastic operations of this nature during the Arab Revolt was the destruction of large parts of the old city of Jaffa in May-June 1936. Now, just for some context, this is a map of Jaffa from 1918. So until like the early 1800s, the city was fortified and confined to its walled boundaries. But like many other cities in the region, in the late 19th century, the walls come down and the city starts to sort of expand further into its hinterlands. But also it's in the same period that Jewish colonial immigration to Palestine begins. And by 1909, Tel Aviv is built north of Jaffa. So this is the location of the old city of Jaffa, and this is Tel Aviv. This is an aerial photograph of Tel Aviv bordering one of Jaffa's neighborhoods, Manshiyeh, if anyone knows. This is Tel Aviv in red. So although Tel Aviv is quite insignificant before World War I, the boundaries between Jaffa and Tel Aviv were already starting to cause some frictions due to their proximity. Now, what's important for us here is that when the British decide to take punitive measures against Jaffa during the 36 revolt, they were mainly interested in the old city of Jaffa and not the new suburbs that were growing south and north of the city. And the 38th report justified this choice based on the old city's population and their socioeconomic status. The old city of Jaffa, the British report states, and I quote, had long been a hotbed of lawlessness and revolt, and as such had usually set the example for rebellious activity all over the country, end quote. It also goes further to explain that rumors of a rival port project at Tel Aviv were particularly badly received amongst Jaffa's old city's population, most of whom were workers in the harbor. Now, it wasn't just the old city's population that was a problem for the British. It was also the architecture and the built layout of the old city. From this diagram on the left, we can already see that the layout of the old city was not made of straight lines in an ordered grid like Beersheba, which we saw earlier, or even Jaffa's own newer neighborhoods. So the British described it as a rabbit warren and referred to its streets as a dark, narrow street that turned and twisted like a maze. They also describe how its position on an elevated hill relative to both the sea and the new neighborhoods granted it a vertical advantage over the other parts of the city. So for the British, this was a major threat because on the one hand, they couldn't navigate the old city themselves. And on the other hand, they thought that it was easily convertible into a citadel for Palestinian rebels. This is a photograph just to show you the elevated nature of the old city. So all of these social and physical features of the old city turned it into a main target for one of Britain's earliest operations against an urban center during the Great Revolt. Between 30th of May and the 30th of June, 1936, the British undertook a series of operations that radically altered the future of the revolt and the city. They basically sent airplanes with leaflets that dropped over the old city's residents, telling them to evacuate, a quite familiar practice today. And then they started dynamiting their way through the old city's houses. Now, on the pages of the military lessons report, the brief description of the British military strategy in Jaffa is supplemented by a series of 6 aerial photographs. The photographs, taken in bird's eye view, depict the city both before and after the demolition operations. On them, points marked A, B, C, and D appear indicating the A to B line of demolitions for the first phase of the operation and the C to D crescent shape for the second phase. And this is why it's quite important to pause at these aerial photographs and to look at how the destruction of an entire urban fabric appears as a merely technical operation. It is really the aerial image that allows for such a level of abstraction, where the action against the old city appears as the simple mechanical drawing of a line between 2 points, which on the ground entailed, and I quote, the strategic opening of good wide roads through the old labyrinth of alleys, end quote. But of course, through other photographs and local testimonies in the operations of aftermath, we begin to see a different perspective. We can see that in its destruction of Jaffa's historic center, the connecting tissue between the port and the city's new suburbs, the operation violently obliterated the commercial and residential heart of the city. It also left hundreds of Palestinian families homeless, pushing them out of Jaffa. The anti-urban operation was so severe that the British condemned it that it marked the end of organized resistance in the towns during the period of the revolt, pushing rebel activities completely to the hills and the countryside from June 1936 onwards. It also shows us how by the 1930s, aerial imagery starts to enter the domain of the city, not only as a tool of representation and analysis of urban environments, like we saw in Dalman quite early on, but also as a tool to interfere in these environments and remodel them so that they would become legible to colonial planners and administrators. Now, to conclude with a few thoughts, the developments of aerial power and aerial photography in the interwar period was a global phenomenon, not limited to the Middle East and not limited to Palestine. However, in examining some of the principal aerial activities of the Germans and the British in Palestine during the first half of the 20th century, it is evident that Palestine, both as a strategic frontline during the Great War and as a mandated territory in the decades that followed, was a site where major developments had taken place in the motivations behind and sciences of aerial photography and cartography. These developments, which were mainly experimental and born out of situations of crisis, were crucial in serving both the German and British interests in direct warfare and military surveillance, but also for the British maintaining imperial control and crashing attempts at anti-colonial insurgency. But also for the British, the nature of aerial power and its uses shifted considerably between the Great Revolt and the Great War and the Arab Revolt. Adjustments had to be made in aerial strategy based on the different kind of warfare in the two situations and the different nature of the enemy. In World War I, the British were fighting against clear military targets with traceable lines of infrastructure, logistics, and communication. Hence, through aerial surveillance, the ability to see these elements and their size and study them and their position within the landscape was directly linked with the ability to target them and gain warfare advantage. In the case of the Arab Revolt, however, the main British target was the local population. While in urban settings, as we saw in Jaffa, aerial power granted the British a great advantage, this was not the case with the rural mountains. There, armed guerrillas were elusive and constantly on the move. And for the British, flying at close distance to the ground posed quite a high risk. So it is under these conditions that the British had to devise a new strategy of combined action, which later would prove quite useful in other colonies, but also in World War II. So what we come to learn from all of this is that not only that aerial power was shaping territory, but that it was also shaped by it. Colonial administrators had to constantly adjust their strategies to accommodate the features of the land and its topography. The physical nature of deserts, hills, and cities determined which aerial technologies and strategies were transferable between different places within the empire and which ones were not. So on the one hand, the view from above was instrumental for creating new facts on the ground and new methods of territorial abstraction, while on the other, the grounds' complex folds and terrains could never be fully homogenized or abstracted into a single formula. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadi. This is an incredible trajectory, searing deep analysis. I was blown away to take us from the Sinai Agreement between British Egypt and the Ottoman Empire to link that international border and everything, well, too little that we know about it, all the way to the aerial bombardment of Jaffa, and then to show me something I hadn't considered, why the rural Palestinian revolt, or the Great Revolt, was turned out so quickly, so rural.
Yeah.
So the turn to a rural revolt, in some ways, the way I understood it, was always the destruction of the Palestinian leadership, urban leadership, right? But here, with the aid of aerial cartography, I have a totally new perspective on this. This is fascinating. And in terms of aerial bombardment, you quoted Priya Satya, and the way in which bombs were dropped in Iraq to quell the Iraqi insurrection. I think the first ones were the Italians, I think, in Libya, right, in 1911. When they bombed it helped them win their war of conquest against the Ottoman Arab forces, people like Shakib Aslan and other voluntaries. And so to not conceive of the aerial like planes as indicating military superiority, but conceptual and sort of form of governmentality, I hadn't fully figured that out. I mean, of course, we know that colonialism uses these to be colonized and colonial areas as laboratories, right, to test their ideas. And here we see how both the Germans, but then of course, especially the British with Hanshaw, Thomas, and then Bomber Harris, of all people, should play such a big role. Absolutely fascinating. I have questions, but I'm mindful that this is also a student event. And I'm looking, are there already questions in the chat box? Yasmin or Dana, would you like to read them out?
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely go on and read this first one from Lina. So the question goes, the maps, photographs, and other primary sources you've used are fascinating. I wonder if you've faced challenges in trying to access or find these materials, given your academic focus is exactly focused on archive work, historical sources, etc., and of course also Israel's high levels of censorship and restriction of sources generally.
Thank you. And thanks, Jens, for that comment. It's a lot of food for thought. In terms of the maps, well, you have to travel a lot to find maps of Palestine because everyone produced maps of Palestine. So you'll find a lot in the Netherlands. You'll find some in. I mean, the ones I was using today. I mean, the aerial photographs. The German aerial photographs are in the Bavarian State Archive, so in Munich. There's a lot in Australia because, as I was saying, the British actually hired, like most of the British forces were Australian squadrons. So you'd find that a lot of the maps are in the National Library of Australia. Now, of course, with digitization, there's a lot of effort to make these accessible by some institutions. The Australians are quite good at it, particularly. Of course, a lot of the collections are in the National Library of Israel and the Israel State Archives. The thing with the Israel State Archives is that now you can't actually go to a physical place. That's not an option anymore. So they selectively digitize some stuff, but not everything. With the National Library of Israel, you sort of have to go there for most of the stuff. But that's also challenging, of course, for different reasons. But yeah, I mean, yeah, depends what period, who the producer is. If you have, yeah, if you're interested in finding a particular collection, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Great, thanks. That's a great answer. It's really interesting to hear that you have to do that. I had no idea for sure. I'm gonna pass it over to Alejandro because he had a question as well.
Yeah, sorry, since then there's been more questions being brought up, Nadi, but I'll jump in and try to keep it short. First of all, incredible talk, really important and uncanny to think of the line that you're tracing and how it's played out in yet another way that the state of Israel has taken over from the British colonial techniques. My question has to do a little bit more with the 19th century because as you probably know better than I, there's work that's showing the importance of cartography. Even Said goes back to the French invasion and, bringing along the cartographers and the knowledge producers of France. And I'm interested in how the cartography has been used as a method to know Palestine as the Holy Land, in particular, dating back to people like Edward Robinson and kind of this Orientalist attempt to map the biblical land onto Palestine of the 19th century. And I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit about what changes with aerial photography, because I was intrigued by, I don't remember the name of the Orientalist that you mentioned now from the 20s, but I was intrigued that this Orientalist saw this as a new way of thinking about the Holy Land. Maybe I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Alejandro. That's a brilliant question. Well, most of the mapping practices that do take place in Palestine, and what I mean by mapping practices is more systematic ones. So we already see that, of course, with Napoleon, the whole 1799 campaign, there are already a lot of maps by Jussin being produced then. Also the British start to produce a lot of maps, and these are very, very high quality in terms of the scale. In 1840, and so immediately after the Egyptian occupation of Palestine, the British start to take over and literally map every major town on the coast, mainly to suggest new fortifications. So although the fortifications go within 20, 30 years, they were all rebuilt more or less in some of the main cities in the 1840s. And so the maps are really mostly of the cities and their surroundings, but they're quite accurate. Now, what happens in the 1860s is that the Palestine Exploration Fund gets established, and that's 1865, I believe. And so this is the first foot of the British in Palestine that is in the domain of archaeology, but also a lot of cartography takes place. And so a lot of the maps of Western Palestine, which are, quite famous now, and everyone sort of tries to go look for their village on the map of Western Palestine. That's actually a British map from the mid-19th century. And it's highly biblical because it's not just that maps are being produced, but studies and books. And all of these try to reiterate the biblical element of Palestine's geography and history. So it's very biased. And although Palestine is undergoing major changes in this period, we're getting railways, we're getting new ports, we're getting infrastructure, but somehow that the eye seems to miss all of that because of the biblical lens that they're using. All of this is almost not mentioned, but usually, biblical references, Nablus is Shechem, all of these also ancient names are brought back to life and given a new life. So this persists into the late 19th century. I would say it even persists throughout the mandate. This doesn't disappear. Dalman, the man I mentioned, was actually a pioneer of this. He was an Orientalist par excellence. He was actually a theologian. And so he does come to Palestine with a lot of biblical charge. But what's fascinating, and which is why I mentioned his book, is that I think the aerial photograph for him is a moment of reflection, that he is critical of all these practices. And the people he's critical of are his contemporaries, and basically him just 10 years before. So he starts to see the power of the aerial image. And to him, of course, it's not biblical anymore, but still ideological, because to him, the aerial photograph is reality. It's not a certain representation of reality. And that brings with it its own set of biases. And these are the discourses that emerge from that point onward. But yes, that's why Dalman specifically is quite an interesting figure here, because he's part of that, but hints at the point of departure. Jacob Norris does this quite well in his book, Land of Progress. He sort of comments on this shift of seeing Palestine from the land of promise to the land of progress, and the role of technology and development in that. So it's an interesting question, but I feel like we can talk about it for ages.
Thank you, Nadi. That was a great answer. I'm going to move forward asking Samuel's question. Do you find that the photos seek destruction sites or strategic zones marked by cactus borders when depicting rural areas? And if so, does the priority begin to shift to the human-made thorn borders in the later mandate period? I'm thinking of Zez Alexandrovic's interest in barbed wire, celebrated as a promise of Israeli sovereignty.
Sorry, I sort of missed that. Is it written somewhere?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A portion. I'm not sure if you can access that.
It's the one by Samuel. Do you find that photos seek destruction sites or strategic zones marked by cactus borders when depicting, and if so, I'm a bit, and so priority given to shift. I don't know what's meant entirely by the question, but do cactus borders? Well, cactus borders do appear on some of the maps, especially those produced by the Palestine Exploration Funds, because they were depicting many things, but including plants. And of course, later on, we realize now, if you go and move in a car in 48, the villages are destroyed, but the cactus fences are more or less still there, as signs of the presence of the village. But I'm not sure if I understood the question entirely. So maybe if you can clarify,
I'll invite Samuel to either type that in the chat or say it out loud if he'd like to explain it further. I'll give a couple seconds. But in the meantime, we could actually move forward to another question by Lean. And it says aerial imagery today can inform alternative methods for creating maps, namely through remote sensing. What do you think are the issues we should keep in mind as we map moving forward?
Thanks for that. Actually, when I was at UofT, I studied geographical information systems, which was a lot of remote sensing. And that's a very technical field. And actually, in many ways, I could say that that was even and somehow of an inspiration behind even doing or embarking on this work, because the way it's taught is very ahistorical. We learn the physics and maths and all of that of it, but we never really think of how and why do these strategies get developed in the first place. And things like remote sensing and what I was just talking about in terms of turning aerial photographs into maps. I mean, this is the context of it, right? This is how it's initiated in World War I. So I think maintaining a historical lens, but also a critical lens when approaching cartography and remote sensing, but also other tools of geographical information systems is very significant, and not much has been done not much has been done by people who are very aware of the technical elements of this field. So maybe if you can do both, it's great.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Samuel to speak because he also has his hand raised right now, so he can elaborate on his question.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Hi, Samuel. Yes.
Hi, and thank you. Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself without being invited to do so, so I think I had to wait. But anyway, what I wanted to ask about the cactus is, well, first of all, does it start to become replaced by human-made borders, as far as the photographs document, number one? And number two, is there more of a documentation of human-made borders? It always seemed to me that there was a parallel between the building of barbed wire and as a sort of newer technology to create zones in the mandate period and afterward. A parallel between that and the past that you were talking about of the cactuses having been sort of longtime survivors especially to mark these rural zones or to mark one plantation or one farm from another. Do they start to become replaced either physically or just in the sort of volume of photographs that are produced that are trying to document how land is distributed?
Thanks for that. The thing with aerial photographs is that there's a lot to see, and unless you're looking for something specific, then it's hard to make note of all the details that are in the aerial photograph. So the answer is I do not know, but what I can say is that my familiarity with barbed wire was more with the Tegart line that I was mentioning, because that was an international border that was initially sort of built with barbed wire. But I know that's not your question. You're asking more in countryside settings. But that sort of begins a whole operation of bringing all these people to create this very hard line border. But in terms of the separation between the villages themselves, I think that happens much later than the mandate period. I think until then, land ownership, it's still quite settled. There aren't major conflicts over land as would happen later on after 48. I'm sorry I don't have a full answer to your question, but I can check for you.
Oh, that's kind of you. I need to do my own homework here, but thank you very much for that. I'll definitely look into more about the Tegart line in particular.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nadi. On to this next question by Sarah. So she says, Nadi, thank you, great talk. Iraqi sociologist Ali Al-Wardi's take on what I see as technologies of subjugation, airplanes, he, albeit nascently, highlights the contradictions of modernity mocking Iraqi responses and interpretation of these technologies while also highlighting their brutality. I'm wondering if you've come across similar responses from Palestinian intellectuals. How did they view these technologies? I'd also like to invite Sada to elaborate if she would like to.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's quite it's quite clear. Let me say two things. First, I like what you said about mocking mocking responses, because the 36 revolt, at least in Palestine, produced a lot of caricatures, Palestinian caricatures of British military strategy, and they're quite funny. Most of them were published in Palestine newspaper, which was based in Jaffa. And a lot of them were, generally they were commentaries on the general state of affairs in Palestine and the mandate. So not really directly, there are mentions of technology, but more about the Rutenberg hydropower project and other things, not specifically aerial photography. But what we get in one of the accounts on the Jaffa case, which I was talking about, is that the leaflets were dropped a night before the demolition took place by airplanes. And the moment, and we get this account from Ad-Difa', which is a newspaper from Jaffa, the next day, is that the moment that happened, the residents of the old city took these leaflets and threw them back at the office of the British sort of military general in Jaffa, which was in the main sarai. So there was already this sort of response, and the fact that it had to be written in a newspaper and published and talked about. It was some sort of mockery, but not very directly. So yeah, I mean, Palestinians and newspapers are a great source for this. If you look at accounts from 36, you'll find some humor in addition to mockery of British strategy.
Thanks, Nadi. On to Adrian's question. Can you comment on the story of people on the ground? How did they perceive aerial technology? Did they try to counter its gaze in any ways on the battlefield and in the sphere of governance? How did aerial ways of knowing get translated into Arabic?
That's a great question. Two things. So what I just said was sort of a hint at that, but of course this is like the most simple of counter strategies. What the thing with these operations and the 36 revolt in particular is that they sort of suspended all of the ways that the Palestinian elites in those cities were used to acting. So they had functional municipal councils at the time. They had all of these strategies in which they were trying to negotiate with the mandate over their urban rights in general. But all of these get suspended. And so you get a very hard divide within Palestinian society. And that's usually credited as the reason for why it failed, between those who wanted to still negotiate with the British and those who were all for armed resistance, and mostly in the countryside, like Kawakji, like others. And these two strands come up with very different understandings of their relationship to Britain and the British. So you'd see publications from both sides of the game, and actually in a lot of their memoirs, they're basically mostly critical of each other than they are of the mandate. So I wouldn't say that there's a unified counter view that the Palestinians had. Maybe I think there were two at the time. There were those that were for capitulation and basically going back to the status quo, and those who were trying to basically carry arms. So these were the Palestinian responses. They were able to shoot down a lot of the airplanes, not enough to win over the British forces, but that happened in quite a few instances, including in the hills of Jerusalem. So there's that part of my answer, but I'll also tell you something about how does aerial technology get translated into Arabic. Actually, this happens much later, and it happens in the so after World War II. So the period we're talking about, aerial power in general in the world, and not only in Palestine, is still not taken for granted as that's how war happens. You know, this is still the early phases of it being experimented with. But after World War II, everything changes. War becomes airlines and air power. And so in the 1940s, there's actually an Egyptian magazine, architectural magazine, that starts to basically dedicate entire issues to technologies of flight and their influence on urban planning and how they should be incorporated within the planning of Arab cities. So that happens much later than the period I'm talking about. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thanks, Nadi. I mean, if there are any questions, they can definitely type that in the chat. We can elaborate. I'm actually going to go ahead and ask Ozer's question. So it goes, thank you for this incredible talk, Nadi. I'm curious to know if Fazal Sheikh's Erasure Trilogy and Desert Bloom project figures into your project or research. And thank you to Hearing Palestine Forum at UofT for organizing this. If you'd like to elaborate further in the chat, you're obviously more than welcome to, or if you'd like to speak up for sure. But yeah, that's the question.
My answer is simple. It doesn't so far, but maybe it should. Thank you. Thank you for this suggestion.
Thanks. There's also another question from Adrian. So it goes, we hosted Rashid Khalidi last time, and he told us that the revolt brought hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were brought to wage war against Palestine. From the perspective of aerial photography, how can we understand both the dramatic growth of land troops and the increased strategic importance of aerial power?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the main thing here is that the main point about the British strategy of combined action in Palestine, and why is it so specific and different than Iraq, is that it did require a lot of ground troops, is that it wasn't just aerial power alone. It was about being able to communicate between aerial power and ground power. Most military action would take place by ground troops. Aerial power was there to sort of do the surveillance part, to get the information, and then communicate it, so that the ground troops would go and sort of attack quite efficiently. So that's the explanation that I have. So both were very important. And that's what was innovative, more or less, about that strategy from the British perspective.
Thanks, Nadi.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to invite anyone who has any further questions, maybe Jens.
Lots of questions. I'll keep that for a later day. I think we've learned so much already. I don't want to break this up. If there's any more pressing question, I think we're happy to field that or those. It's also so wonderful to see so many colleagues and people from Palestine, from Boston, if I look in the chat, my own students, current students in the Arab intellectuals class and in my modern Palestine class. So thank you all for coming. Is this a good moment to thank Nadi, or is it premature?
So much research.
Yeah,
it's just so brilliant, honestly.
When do we get to read it in print, Nadi? Where's it? We're looking forward to it.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Orlando.
All right, Dana, do you want to do the ceremonial ending and the segue to the next event?
Of course. I can actually hand that over to Yasmin, but I just wanted to thank you so much, Nadi, for the very enriching talk. Your line of work is so critical, and because of the constant censorship, it's always so refreshing hearing such thorough research on the architectural, landscape, and cartographic disciplines in relation to Palestine. And it's definitely like so incredibly important to engage ourselves within these conversations and question where the urbanist landscape and cartographic discipline stand in perpetuating power dynamics and erasure. So once again, thank you so much for sharing all this incredible knowledge. I'll hand it over to Yasmin to introduce the next one.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Nadi, for this great talk. If you want to learn more about what's happening with the center, you can join this event. It started about like 20-30 minutes ago, but I'm sure they're still going on. And if you want to learn more about Hearing Palestine and the Palestine Forum and even Arab urbanism, you can check out these links. We do have events coming up for Hearing Palestine. The next one should be in about a month or so, and it will be hosting Nadi Abusaada, who's here with us. So we look forward to seeing you at the next one. You can probably register in the next coming weeks. Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Nadi.
Thank you all.
Take care and see you soon.
Great
Bye.
stuff, Nadi. See you soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Alejandro. See you soon.
Thanks, Nadi.
Bye.